Hey everybody, this is International Master David Pruess for Chess.com, and today I'm going to show you two really aesthetic chess moments. So this should hopefully be entertaining as well as enlightening for some of you. And one of these is super tactical and the other is super technical. So I'm hoping that those of you who really like tactics will enjoy the tactic enough to check out the endgame and to see how cool an endgame can be, and that those of you who like endgames will enjoy the end game enough to have a look at this tactic as well. So both examples come from the Gibraltar Chess Tournament right now, which is going on. Super strong tournament that has been building and getting stronger over the years recently, and now has a dozen of the world's best players playing in it. And the first example comes from Judith Polgar, who maintains a very sharp style of play and absolutely beautiful calculation. So here she's playing white, and her opponent plays e4, initiating a fight. And it attacks the knight, which is busy defending this bishop, and it's really based on undermining this pawn on c4, right? The simplest variation of what black envisions is that white takes this pawn, and then black can take on c4, and the queen is attacked. It's defended, but white's probably going to do something like trade the queens, but then they won't be able to take this pawn because of the e-file. If they don't trade queens, they still can't take the pawn, right? Because they're still losing material along this file. So that is black's basic idea here with e4, is that this pawn can't really take because black will be able to take on c4, and then the white pawn on e4 will be pinned along this file. But Polgar played a fantastic move here. The first point of her move, c5, is simply that black can't play queen takes c4 anymore. So if black played something like pawn takes pawn, Judith can take on e4 in the center of the board, and now without queen takes c4, her rook on e2 is defended, and the center is going to open up. Well, when the center opens up, she will have a nice passed pawn on d5 and a weak black king to work with, whereas black will have a bunch of extra pawns over on the queen side. But she's imagining a position that could look something like this, just to clarify the position so it's easier for you all to imagine what this kind of position would look like. And see, what she's evaluating here is that this passed pawn, which is pretty far advanced already, and this weak king give her a huge advantage versus, if black tried to have three passed pawns here, they're not going to factor in the game the way her chances against the black king will. So that's the simpler tactical point, but that's what they're fighting over, is this c4 thing. But what it gets into then is this whole complicated tactics around hanging pieces over here, right? So that's what actually gets played. So that's what we get to see in the actual game, is that black took up the challenge and took the piece. So Polgar takes on e7. Black takes back, Polgar takes back. Now here, if black takes on e7, she can just recapture and she wins back the piece she sacrificed on f3. But meanwhile, her bishop defends that pawn on c5. So now she's basically breaking through in the center with two really far advanced pawns. And this position is going to be hopeless for black. So black didn't take the rook, black took the bishop. And now black has a bishop and a knight against a rook in a really complicated position that's hard to evaluate. And Judith had to look beyond this point here when she played c5, because it would be very hard to judge this position as being good for white with the rook attacked and facing a knight and bishop. It doesn't look like she has enough material here to attack the black king, but Judith seemed quite deeply. She checks the king because her rook was attacked, then just retreats it all the way. She has to lose the tempo, but now she's getting ready for a very strong attack against the enemy king, even though there are limited forces on the board. The key is to let her queen into the light squares with d4, and after black takes, she brings her queen in and her rook in, and now she's going to crack this square here on d6 and get a passed pawn. So the black king is a little bit vulnerable. I mean, he certainly has enough cover on him, and there are only two attacking pieces, so he's not in danger of being checkmated if his pieces can defend against him, but his pieces have to watch over him a little bit, but they also have to watch over this passed pawn. So this is like a different version of like a principle of two weaknesses, which is usually seen in sort of a technical way where it's like you've got two weaknesses you need to defend, and one is like a pass pawn, the other is a weak pawn, something like that. But here it's like a vulnerable king and a potential pass pawn, and it's a very tactical situation. So she gets the pass d pawn, and in this position here, black simply resigned because they can't capture this pawn because she'll take the knight. Right? And so they can't deal with white's central pass pawns here. Judith's also threatening to play queen b3 check and bring her queen into f7. So black just gives up. There's really nothing that they can do. Now, our second example for today comes from Michael Adams of England. And just as Polgar is famous for having extremely good and sharp calculation in crazy positions, Adams is famous for having beautiful insight into how to win simple-looking positions, and often positions which look like about equal. But he finds like great little plans, uses his last one or two pieces very, very efficiently, and creates surprising winning motifs. So this position here, Adams had sacked a pawn. He was attacking against the black king, and at this point he could take a draw by checking the black king back and forth. Right? Can we see that here? That if the king goes back and forth and the rook goes back and forth, the black king will just be a draw. But Adams chooses to go into the rook endgame down a pawn, knowing that his king and rook are better placed than the black king and rook. He has artificially isolated these three black pawns. Let's next talk about the pawn structure. These three pawns are technically on neighboring files, but because the f pawn is so backward, he's sort of isolated the three pawns so that they're all targets. And finally, this nice pawn on a5 cripples these two pawns, and it's nice and far advanced. It's close to queening. That's really key in a lot of endgames, a lot of rook endgames, to have like a pawn that's really close to queening. And you might say, like, what, that pawn's not queening? There's like two pawns easily blocking it. White doesn't have any dynamics for breaking through. But having this pawn closer to the queening square is crucial for why Adams felt that he could press and win this endgame, as you will see. So king here switches his rook over. His rook from here will be able to attack the b pawn from either of these squares. Black has to stay tuned to find out which one white is going in. Black develops his rook defending the pawn, and white improves his king further and improves the pawns on the queen side further, so this pawn is closer to queening also. Very important. And now he plays a tempo to force the rook back there. Then he comes back to d5 with his rook. So now if black plays rook to e8 back, Adams is going to play rook takes e5 if he feels like it, or he might play king takes g5 first and then come back to f5. But he's prepared to win this pawn now, right? It can't be defended anymore. Pawn to f6, of course, is bad because the rook check forces the king back to a worse position, and white can still eat all this stuff. So black plays b6, and rook endgames are very, very often drawn. So black only needs to trade one or two things here before he would easily get a draw, right? Like if Adams takes, and he takes, and Adams starts munching these pawns over here, and black takes like this, black has no problem at all drawing this game. It's going to be over in a moment in a draw. But Adams had foreseen and planned that black could not get out of the queenside bind with this move b6 because of b5. And this is a typical breakthrough idea. Obviously, you can only do this if your pawns are further up the board than your opponent's pawns, right? Otherwise, when you make this breakthrough, you give them a pass pawn which queens before you. But here, the point is really cool. If black takes this pawn, then Adams takes this one, and then he gets his rook behind this pass pawn, and this pass pawn is tying down the black rook mightily, right? And he's going to win this kind of a situation. And if black takes the other way, he can again take with his rook. Now this pawn can't capture because of the rook on b8. And then next, he takes with this pawn, and again, he gets this kind of winning situation where, like here, maybe to blockade the pawn one step further, but his king is going to come over and attack the rook, and then he'll queen this pawn. And if the black king runs over there, then maybe he can just capture the pawns on the king side, right? Like this, take this one too, and then come over here And now, if black ever takes on b6, white will win on the king side, like this. Black has no way out of this. If he tries to switch his rook so the king can get behind the pawn, Adams is just always going to push the pawn because he's always willing to have the rook trade. So let's go back to this breakthrough position. So that's the basic idea. If black takes either way, Adams will be able to get his rook behind the other pawn, and it'll be an advanced pass pawn. Black resorts to another attempted defense. He plays his rook to a8. This is a very, very tricky defense, which could almost have saved the game here. What black is threatening is to take the pawn on a5. And then if white takes on a6, he can take back with his rook. And if Adams takes this way, black takes here, he comes here, and he comes here, and again, it's a draw. So Adams is obviously going to take this pawn, right, trying to queen this one. But now black's point of playing this rook a8 move was he wants to play a5. Not a takes b5, allowing Adams' rook to get behind the pawn and push it home, but a5, creating a new distraction past pawn. And look, if Adams' rook tries to go fetch that pawn, then Friedman can just collect these pawns with his rook. And again, he draws easily. Also, Adams can't win by just trying to queen this pawn, because the rook will just come here attacking it. He can't put his rook behind it. If he defends like this pawn just runs, right? Breaks it up. Eventually, he has to send his rook back to go get it. And then black will collect both of the b pawns. So here's a second question for you. Even after all this great technique that Adams has used to pressurize this position, the breakthrough tactic, still, how on earth does white win this position? The key is just to ask yourself this: what job should your rook do and what job should your king do? Right? If you're playing with only your rook, you're not going to win this endgame on the queen side, actually. So you have to think of like what should be the role of the rook and what should be the role of the king. Well, it's actually forced. The role of the rook has to be to catch the a-pawn. And that makes sense because you let your opponent spend 3-4 moves on the a-pawn and then you can catch it in 2 moves with your rook. Your rook's faster than the pawn, so that makes sense. And what should be the role of your king? It should be to come help this pawn queen because your rook's not good at doing that. So once you realize all of that, do you know how to win this endgame for white? Adams played king takes e5, bringing his king over to the queen side. And after a4, he brought his king over this way. a3, grabs a pawn for good measure just to gain a check. Here black resigned. I'll show you why. They moved their king, for example. Wherever they move it, Adams is going to get his rook to an open file with gain of tempo. For example, king f6, check. And then his rook got to an open file and it can deal with the a-pawn, right? But even if black played king f8 so there was no check, Adams would play rook h5, and he's threatening rook h8 check and rook takes a8. So black would have to prevent that, and then he would win in the same way. He pushes his pawn, this rook moves, then he brings in his king to queen the pawn, and when this pawn goes to queen, he can always just cover it with his rook. And that is how you use your king, and that is how you use your rook, and put that together, and you know how to win rook endgames. So I hope you appreciated both Polgar's sharp sword and Adams' true technique. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.